Empty your pockets, Miller. Henderson's voice dripped with something mean, like he'd caught her stealing more than time. But Isabel knew she hadn't taken anything. Not a dime. Rage, cold and familiar, settled in her. Years she'd spent shrinking, trying to disappear. All for her brother Leo. And now this? But Henderson, that slick snake, had no idea. Didn't realize Isabel held a secret language. One that could turn his gilded cage into a viper's pit. A language of hands, of kindness. The kind that billionaires crave and bullies can't comprehend. See, they all thought she was just a ghost. They have no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. What she didn't know was that from the darkest corner of the restaurant, a man who owned the very ground she stood on was watching. He wasn't just any billionaire. He was a man with a secret pain, and she had just unlocked the door to his carefully guarded world. The Gilded Compass wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night a performance of wealth and status played out across its marble floors and under its crystal chandeliers. And every night Isabel Miller was one of the nearly invisible stagehands. At 24, she moved with a quiet efficiency that bordered on apologetic. Her shoulders perpetually curved inward, as if to minimize the space she occupied in the world. Her smile, though genuine, was fleeting, a brief flicker of light before she retreated back into the shadows of her duties. Her life was a landscape of muted colors, the beige walls of her tiny apartment, the gray cityscape through her window, in the starched black and white uniform she wore 6 nights a week. The only vibrant color in her memory was the bright, infectious laugh of her younger brother, Leo. But that color had faded 3 years ago, leaving behind a silence that was far more profound than the absence of sound. Leo had been born deaf, and the world he had taught Isabel, a world of expressive hands and silent conversations, was now her most treasured and most painful secret. It was a language she hadn't used since she'd last said goodbye to him in a sterile hospital room. The restaurant paid the bills, or rather it chipped away at the mountain of medical debt Leo's illness had left behind. Each polished fork and perfectly folded napkin was a small step toward solvency. Her manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose ambition was as sharp as the creases in his trousers, ensured the pressure was never off. He saw Isabel's shyness not as a personality trait, but as a professional defect. "Miller, you're a ghost," he'd sneered during a staff meeting. "Our clientele pays for an experience, not just food. They want confidence, charisma. Try to at least pretend you belong here." Tonight, the performance at the Gilded Compass was reaching its crescendo. The dining room hummed with the low thrum of powerful conversations. But in a dim, secluded booth in the far corner, a different kind of power sat in silence. Damian Blackwood did not look like the architect of a global financial empire. Dressed in a simple dark sweater and foregoing any jewelry, he could have been mistaken for a university professor or a brooding artist. But his eyes missed nothing. They were eyes of cold slate, scanning the room with a practiced analytical gaze that valued assets and identified liabilities. The Gilded Compass was one of his more recent, smaller acquisitions, a bauble in his vast portfolio. He was here unannounced for a final personal inspection before a crucial meeting tomorrow. He was assessing everything from the temperature of the wine to the morale of the staff, and what he saw for the most part was a predictable, well-oiled machine of sycophantic service. He watched Mr. Henderson glide between tables, his smile a mask of practiced charm that didn't quite reach his eyes. He watched the waiters move with a brisk, almost frantic energy. Then his gaze fell on Isabel. He noted her hesitant posture, the way she avoided eye contact, refilling water glasses and clearing plates with a quiet deference that was different from the others. She wasn't performing. She was simply serving. He dismissed her as inefficient, a weak link Henderson would need to address, a liability. Damian's phone vibrated on the table. A text message. "Running 15 late. D." He typed back a curt "Fine." He was waiting for his sister Clara Ara. The thought of her brought a familiar tightening in his chest, a protective instinct so fierce it was almost suffocating. He'd practically raised her after their parents' public, messy divorce had left them as emotional collateral. He was all she had, and he had poured all his resources into protecting her from a world that was not built for her. He signaled for a coffee, and it was Isabel who approached his table. "Excuse me, sir," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper above the restaurant's hum. "Black coffee," he said, not looking up from his phone. She nodded and slipped away. He didn't even register her face. To him, she was just a function, a pair of hands. He turned his attention back to his preliminary report, his mind already moving on to multi-million-dollar deals and corporate strategy. He was a man who lived in a world of loud, decisive actions and earth-shaking numbers. He had no time for whispers. He had no idea that the quietest person in the room was about to cause the biggest disruption his carefully controlled world had ever known. The grand entrance of the Gilded Compass was designed for dramatic arrivals. A young woman with a cascade of dark auburn hair stepped through the heavy glass doors, her vibrant green coat a splash of defiance against the restaurant's muted palette of gold and mahogany. She paused, her eyes a shade of blue as clear and deep as a mountain lake, taking in the opulent surroundings. This was Clara Ara Blackwood, the hostess at the front desk. A polished young woman named Tiffany offered a gleaming professional smile. "Good evening. Welcome to the Gilded Compass. Do you have a reservation?" Clara Ara met her gaze and offered a small, polite smile in return. She then raised her hands and began to move them in a series of fluid, precise gestures. It was American Sign Language. "Hello. I have a reservation under Blackwood for 2. Tiffany's smile froze, faltering for a fraction of a second before it was pasted back on, this time with a visible strain. Her eyes darted around a flicker of panic in their depths. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice a little too loud, as if increasing the volume would somehow bridge the gap in understanding. Clara Ara's expression remained patient. She signed again, a little slower this time, pointing to herself and then spelling out the name Blackwood. The panic in Tiffany's eyes intensified. "This was not in the training manual," Mr. Henderson's voice echoed in her head. "The guest is always right, but a confused guest is a liability." She fumbled for her tablet, her fingers clumsy on the screen. "Just a moment," she said, her voice wavering. She turned and practically ran towards Mr. Henderson, who was overseeing the wine service near the bar. "Mr. Henderson," she hissed, "there's a situation at the door." Henderson turned his face, a mask of annoyance. "A situation, Tiffany? We don't have situations. We have opportunities for excellence." She can't hear," Tiffany whispered, casting a nervous glance back at the entrance. "She's doing hand things." Henderson's eyes narrowed. He smoothed his tie and strode toward the front, his polished shoes clicking in authoritarian rhythm on the marble. From his corner booth, Damian Blackwood watched the entire exchange, a cold knot of anger tightening in his stomach. This was it, the test. He knew his sister insisted on making her own way, on facing these moments without his intervention. But watching it unfold was a unique form of torture. "Good evening, miss," Henderson said, his voice booming with forced cordiality. He leaned over the hostess stand, speaking slowly and exaggerating the movement of his lips as if she were a child. "Preservation." Clara Ara's jaw tightened slightly. She signed her response, her movements sharp and clear. "Yes, my name is Clara Ara Blackwood. My brother is waiting for me." Henderson stared at her hands, his face a perfect blank of incomprehension. He then pulled out a reservation book and a pen, a gesture of profound condescension. He pointed at the page, then at the pen, and then at her. "Right name," he said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of several nearby diners. A flush of humiliation crept up Clara's neck. All she wanted was to have dinner. She never wanted to cause a scene. She simply wanted to be understood. Isabel was clearing a nearby table when she overheard Henderson's booming voice. She glanced over and saw the young woman at the entrance, saw her frustrated expression, her proud posture, and most importantly, she saw her hands. The movements were as familiar to Isabel as her own reflection. It was the language of her childhood, the language of Leo. A pang of memory, sharp and bittersweet, pierced through her. She saw not a stranger, but a reflection of her brother, trying to navigate a world that refused to meet him halfway. In his booth, Damian's hand clenched into a fist beneath the table. He was seconds away from striding over there, from unleashing a storm of fury that would strip Henderson of his job and his dignity. But he had promised Clara. He had promised he would let her handle it. He watched his heart hammering against his ribs as his sister's independence was ground down by ignorance and arrogance. The restaurant, his restaurant, was failing her. It was failing him, and he was beginning to think his unannounced visit had been a waste of time. He'd seen all he needed to see. As Mr. Henderson pushed the pen and paper towards Clara with an exasperated sigh, a small, quiet voice cut through the tension. "I can help, Henderson." Clara and the flustered hostess all turned. Isabel stood there, a stack of cleared plates in her hands, her eyes fixed on Clara. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to fade back into the shadows where she was comfortable. Henderson's glare alone was enough to make her want to disappear. But the image of Clara's face, that flicker of hurt and frustration, had struck a chord deep within her, a chord that resonated with years of love and loss for her brother, Leo. "Miller, get back to your section," Henderson snapped, turning his back on her dismissively. "This is being handled." But Isabel didn't move. Her gaze was locked with Clara's. Slowly, deliberately, she set the plates down on a nearby service stand. She wiped her slightly trembling hands on her apron and took a hesitant step forward. She looked directly at Clara, offering a small, shy smile that was for the first time that night completely unguarded. Then she raised her hands. The first sign was simple, a gentle wave of the fingers from her temple outward. "Hello." Clara's eyes widened. For a moment, she seemed too surprised to respond. In a world where she was constantly met with confusion and condescension, this sudden, unexpected fluency was like finding an oasis in a desert. Isabel continued her movements, becoming more confident as the familiar language flowed through her. "My name is Isabel. I'm sorry for the confusion. You have a reservation." A brilliant, radiant smile broke across Clara's face, transforming her entire demeanor from tense and guarded to open and relieved. The difference was staggering. She brought her own hands up her movements, quick and expressive, a lifetime of silent conversation flowing from her fingertips. "Yes, Clara Blackwood, my brother Damien should already be here. I am so glad someone understands." From his booth, Damien Blackwood watched utterly transfixed. The world around him seemed to dissolve. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the entire opulent performance of the Gilded Compass faded into nothing. All he saw were the two young women communicating in a silent, graceful ballet of hands. He saw the waitress, the one he had dismissed as a timid liability, speaking his sister's language. Not just speaking it, but understanding it. He could see it in the gentle nod of her head, the empathetic softness in her eyes. She wasn't just translating words, she was connecting with his sister on a human level. He watched Isabel sign back. "Damien Blackwood. Yes, he is waiting for you. Please follow me. I'll take you to his table." Isabel turned and gestured for Clara to follow, completely ignoring Mr. Henderson, who stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, looking from Isabel to Clara and back again, as if he were witnessing some impossible magic trick. He was obsolete, rendered utterly useless by the quiet competence of his most unassuming employee. The look on his face was a mixture of shock and a dawning, venomous resentment. Isabel led Clara through the maze of tables. As they walked, they continued their silent conversation. Isabel signed, "I hope you have not been waiting long." Clara signed back, a small, mischievous glint in her eye. "Not at all. The show at the front door was quite entertaining." Isabel's lips curved into a genuine, unreserved smile. A laugh she didn't know she still had bubbled up inside her. When they reached the booth, Damien stood up. His slate gray eyes, usually so guarded and cold, were filled with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. He looked at Isabel, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the weariness in her posture that was now offset by a quiet spark of confidence. He saw the person who had given his sister a moment of dignity and respect, when his own highly paid management had failed so spectacularly. Clara turned to Isabel and signed, "Thank you. You have no idea how much that meant to me." Isabel's cheeks flushed with color. "It was nothing," she signed back. "Enjoy your dinner." She gave a small nod to Damien and turned to leave, ready to melt back into the anonymity of her job. Wait. Damien's voice, low and commanding, stopped her in her tracks. What is your name? She turned back, surprised. Isabel Miller, sir. He just nodded, his gaze intense, committing her name and face to memory. Thank you, Isabel. As she walked away, her heart still fluttering, she had no idea that her simple act of kindness hadn't just ended a moment of awkwardness. It had set in motion a chain of events that would shatter the gilded cage she lived in and expose the venomous politics of the restaurant she served. For the rest of the evening, a strange energy coursed through the gilded compass. Damien Blackwood did something he never did. During business dinners, he relaxed. He watched his sister Clara chat animatedly with him across the table, her mood lighter and more carefree than he had seen it in months. Every so often, his gaze would drift across the dining room, searching for Isabel. He watched her serve other tables, her movement still quiet and reserved, but there was a subtle change. Her shoulders seemed a little less stooped, her smile a little more frequent. Meanwhile, Mr. Henderson was a storm cloud in a tailored suit. He had been publicly upstaged, a mere waitress, a ghost as he called her, had demonstrated more skill and provided a better guest experience. In 30 seconds than he had with all his blustering authority. It was a direct blow to his pride, and worse, a threat to his position. He had seen the way the man in the corner booth, clearly a person of immense importance, had looked at Isabel. It was a look of profound gratitude and respect, a look that Henderson coveted for himself. He began his campaign subtly. As Isabel passed the kitchen entryway, he stopped her. "Miller," he said, his voice a low hiss. "A word." He led her to a small, cluttered office just off the main floor. The air was thick with the smell of lemon polish and stale coffee. "What you did out there," he began, closing the door behind them, "was reckless. You stepped out of line." Isabel blinked, confused. "Sir, I was just helping a guest. You were undermining your manager." He counted, his voice sharp. "You made the entire front of house staff look incompetent. There are procedures for these things, protocols. You are to clear plates and take orders, nothing more. Do you understand?" "But she needed help," Isabel insisted, a flicker of defiance in her voice. "No one else knew what to do. And that's for me to manage, not you," he seethed. "Your little stunt was an embarrassment." He saw the hurt and confusion on her face and pressed his advantage. "Don't ever let me see you grandstanding like that again. You got lucky this time." The guest was polite. "Next time you could offend someone, stick to your station." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and Isabel retreated, the spark of confidence she had felt earlier, extinguished by his cold fury. She was back in her box, the shy, invisible waitress. But Henderson wasn't finished. He knew that simply reprimanding her wasn't enough. He needed to neutralize the threat she posed. He needed to discredit her in the eyes of the powerful man in the corner. His mind, a weasel-like instrument of petty scheming, went to work. He found Tiffany, the hostess, crying softly in the staff break room. "He looked at me like I was an idiot," she sniffled. "That man," his eyes. Henderson placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It wasn't your fault, Tiffany," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "You were put in an impossible position. In fact, Miller made it worse. She was incredibly rude to you afterward." Tiffany looked up, her eyes red. She was absolutely. Henderson lied smoothly. "She came to me and said your incompetence was a disgrace to the restaurant, that she had to save the day because you were so useless. I defended you, of course. I told her that was no way to speak about a colleague. A seed of resentment was planted. Tiffany's sadness began to curdle into anger at Isabel. Next, Henderson approached one of the senior waiters, a man named George, who was notoriously possessive of the high-tipping VIP tables. "George," Henderson said, pulling him aside, "keep an eye on table 12, the Blackwood party, and keep an eye on Isabel. She's been pushing to get a bigger section. I think she's trying to poach your regulars." This, too, was a complete fabrication, but it was all George needed to hear. He now saw Isabel not as a quiet co-worker, but as a rival. The final piece of his plan was the most venomous. He waited until Damien and Clara Blackwood had finished their main course. He approached their table with 2 glasses of complimentary champagne. Mr. Blackwood, Ms. Blackwood, he said, his voice dripping with charm. I must personally apologize for the misunderstanding at the entrance earlier. It was an inexcusable lapse, and I have already spoken to the staff involved. Damien looked at him with an unreadable expression. Is that so? Yes, Henderson continued, sensing his moment. And while I am grateful that Isabel was able to step in, I do feel I must mention in the interest of transparency that we've had some minor issues with her. A few customer complaints about things going missing from their tables. A wallet last week, a pair of cufflinks the month before. Nothing we could ever prove, of course, he added with a theatrical sigh. But one has to be so careful. I am monitoring the situation very closely. He had laid his trap. He had painted Isabel as insubordinate, a troublemaker, and now a potential thief. He had poisoned the well-confident that no matter how impressed this man had been, the shadow of doubt would be enough to tarnish her. He smiled, satisfied with his work, believing he had masterfully regained control. From across the table, Clara Ara, who had been watching Henderson's lips with focused intensity, looked at her brother. Her hands moved subtly under the table. He is lying. Damien's eyes, which had been cold before, now became glacial. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Henderson, oblivious to the silent conversation happening right in front of him, thought his performance had been a success. He had no idea he wasn't just scheming against a shy waitress. He was trying to deceive a man who could buy and sell his entire world with a single phone call. And that man was now watching him with the predatory patience of a shark that has just scented blood in the water. The end of the night was approaching. The wave of diners had crested and was now receding, leaving behind a scattering of quiet conversations and the clinking of the cleanup crew. Isabel felt a bone-deep weariness. Mr. Henderson's words had replayed in her mind all evening, stripping the joy from her brief moment of connection with Clara. The atmosphere among the staff had also soured. Tiffany refused to meet her eye, and George had twice made passive-aggressive comments about her overstepping. She felt isolated, the familiar chill of being an outsider, seeping back into her bones. Damien and Clara had already paid their bill, settled quietly by Damien's card, which he'd given to a different waiter, and were preparing to leave. Isabel was in the back polishing silverware, trying to remain invisible until her shift was over. That's when Mr. Henderson's voice echoed through the dining room. Isabel Miller, front and center now. The tone was not a request. It was a summons, sharp and laced with a cruel sort of triumph. Every staff member still on the floor stopped what they were doing. The few remaining patrons looked up from their drinks. Isabel's stomach plummeted. She walked out of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. Henderson was standing in the middle of the restaurant. Next to him stood a wealthy-looking couple, a man in his late 50s, and his wife dripping with jewelry. The woman looked distraught. Mrs. Davenport here seems to have misplaced her diamond bracelet, Henderson announced, his voice carrying across the silent room. A family heirloom, I believe. She says she remembers having it on when she sat down. You were their server tonight, weren't you, Isabel? Isabel's blood ran cold. Yes, sir, I was. And you were the one who cleared their table, correct? Yes, but the woman, Mrs. Davenport, spoke up, her voice quivering with accusation. I felt it on my wrist right before dessert. Now it's gone. It was my mother's. Henderson turned to Isabel, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. This was his checkmate. Isabel company policy in a situation like this is quite clear. We need you to empty your pockets and your apron. The world tilted on its axis. Every eye in the room was on her. It was a public execution of her character. She could feel the stars of her colleagues, Tiffany's resentful glare, George's smug smirk. They had been primed by Henderson's lies all night. And now here was the proof he had manufactured. Mr. Henderson, I didn't take anything, she whispered, her voice choked with humiliation. Then you'll have no problem emptying your pockets, he said smoothly. Just a formality to put Mrs. Davenport's mind at ease. Tears pricked at the corners of Isabel's eyes. This was a nightmare. With shaking hands, she pulled out the contents of her apron pockets, a crumpled wad of tips, a pen, a wine key, and her notepad. Nothing else. Henderson's smile didn't falter. Your locker then, and your personal handbag. We will need to search them. This was a step too far. It was an invasion, a violation based on nothing but his cruel whim. You can't do that, she said, finding a sliver of strength in her desperation. Oh, I can, Henderson said, his voice turning hard. In fact, given your history of inattentiveness around customer belongings, I think it's not only justified, but necessary, unless you'd prefer I call the police and have them handle it. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The police, an accusation, a potential record. Her life was already so fragile. An ordeal like that would shatter it completely. Defeated, she gave a single, heartbroken nod. But before Henderson could savor his victory, a calm, powerful voice cut through the silence from the corner of the room. That will not be necessary. Every head turned. Damian Blackwood was walking towards them, Clara Ara by his side. He had been on his way out, but had stopped to watch the scene unfold. His face was a mask of controlled rage. And who might you be? Henderson asked, annoyed at the interruption. I'm the man who owns this restaurant, Damian said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. The color drained from Henderson's face. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Damian didn't even look at him. His eyes, now filled with a protective fire, were on Isabel. You will not be searching her belongings. You will not be speaking to her like that again. In fact, you will not be speaking to her at all. He then turned his gaze to the distraught couple. Mrs. Davenport, he said, his tone shifting from ice to cool reason. While I understand your distress, perhaps you should check the cuff of your husband's jacket, the one he draped over the back of your chair all evening. Mr. Davenport, looking confused, reached for his suit jacket. He felt along the sleeve cuff, and his eyes widened. Tangled in the button was the delicate, glittering strand of the diamond bracelet. It must have caught when he'd reached for his wine glass. A collective gasp went through the room. Mrs. Davenport's face flushed with a mixture of relief and deep embarrassment. The silence that followed was deafening. Henderson stood there exposed as a fool and a bully. His carefully constructed trap had not only failed, but it had snapped shut on him in the most public and humiliating way possible. Damian's gaze, now as cold and sharp as a shard of glass, settled on Henderson. My office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., and I suggest you spend the night updating your resume. He then turned to the rest of the staff. Everyone go home. The restaurant is closed for the night. He looked at Isabel, whose tears were now flowing freely, not from humiliation, but from a profound, dizzying sense of relief. Her silent tormentor had been vanquished. Isabel, Damian said, his voice softening. Can you wait for us for a few minutes? My sister and I would like to speak with you. The gilded compass, now devoid of its patrons, and the frantic energy of service, was an entirely different creature. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of a ventilation system. The low ambient lighting that had once created an atmosphere of intimate luxury now cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, making the vast space feel like a grand, empty cathedral. For Isabel, who sat at a small, isolated table, it felt like the stage of her own life after the final disastrous act. She had been publicly vindicated, yet her entire body still thrummed with the residual tremors of shock and humiliation. She meticulously folded and refolded a linen napkin, the simple, repetitive motion, the only anchor in a sea of overwhelming emotion. Damian and Clara Ara approached her table, their footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. There was no pretense in their movements. They pulled up chairs, not as a billionaire and his sister, but as two people seeking a quiet conversation. The intimidating, powerful aura Damian had projected during the confrontation with Henderson had completely dissolved, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful gravity. Clara Ara, sensing Isabel's fragility, offered a warm, reassuring smile that needed no translation. Isabel, Damian began, his voice low and calibrated to the hushed intimacy of the room. Before anything else, I need to offer you my deepest, most sincere apology. What happened here tonight was not just a failure of management. It was a failure of my organization's core principles. It was a disgusting abuse of power, and it happened on my watch. There is no excuse for it. You don't have to apologize, she murmured, her gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of her folded napkin. You saved me. No. He counted, his tone firm but gentle, insisting she understand. What I did was a simple correction. What you endured should never have happened in the first place. Men like Henderson, men who derive pleasure from intimidating those they believe are beneath them, are a poison. I promise you it's a poison I will be personally rooting out of my company. He paused, letting the weight of his convictions settle in the quiet space between them. He glanced at Clara Ara, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. He seemed for the first time to be a man searching for words that were not related to contracts or quarterly earnings. My sister Clara Ara, he began, his voice softening with an unguarded affection, is the single most important person in my world. She is the anchor of my life. He looked at Clara Ara as he spoke, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. When we were children, our parents were titans of industry. They were celebrated for building empires, but were utter failures at building a family. They were more invested in their public image than in their own children. When Clara Ara was diagnosed as profoundly deaf at age 3, they treated it like a blemish on their legacy, an inconvenience to be managed. They hired specialists, tutors, and an endless parade of nannies to deal with it, but they never once tried to learn her language themselves. They never entered at her world. Isabel finally looked up, her own painful memories bubbling just beneath the surface. She saw in Damien's eyes not a powerful CEO, but the fierce protective love of an older brother, a mirror of the love she had held for Leo. I was 12 years old. Damien continued, a distant look in his eyes as he recalled the past. I watched my 7-year-old sister struggle to be understood, saw her frustration as she was surrounded by people who smiled and nodded, but never truly heard her. So I took my allowance money, walked to a bookstore, and bought a textbook on American Sign Language. It became our secret. In the quiet of our rooms, away from the noise of our parents' lives, we built our own world. It was our fortress, our private language. It's how we survived the loneliness of that house. It's the foundation of everything we are to each other. He brought his focus back to Isabel, his gaze intense. So when I see someone treat her with the kind of lazy condescension that Henderson did, it's difficult to witness. But then when I saw you tonight, you didn't just see a problem to be managed. You didn't just see a deaf woman. You saw her. You looked her in the eye and spoke her language without a moment's hesitation. You offered her dignity. In this world, Isabel, that is a rarer and more valuable commodity than anything my money can buy. The raw honesty in his confession unlocked something deep within Isabel. The story of Leo, a grief she had held so close and so silently for 3 years, rose to her lips. My brother, she said, her voice a fragile whisper. His name was Leo. He was deaf. She had never spoken his name at work. The pain was too sharp, the memory too sacred. But in this strange, abdolent room with these two strangers who somehow felt like kindred spirits, it felt not just safe, but necessary. He passed away 3 years ago, she continued, a sad, distant smile touching her lips as a specific memory surfaced. He taught me everything. He used to get so frustrated with people who thought deafness was a lack of something. He'd sign to me, "My world isn't quiet, is he? It's just a different kind of loud." He was brilliant and funny. She swallowed hard against the lump forming in her throat. After he got sick, I haven't really signed with anyone since. It felt like a language that belonged only to him. The shared unspoken understanding of sibling love, of loss and of fierce protection, filled the space between them, weaving their separate stories into a single resonant chord. Clara Ara reached across the table, her fingers gently covering Isabel's trembling hand. With her other hand, she signed with heartfelt sincerity. He would be so proud of you. What you did was an honor to his memory. A tear escaped Isabel's eye. A single warm drop of catharsis. She signed back her movement, a little rusty, but full of feeling. Thank you. Damien watched them, a resolute, unwavering decision solidifying on his face. He had seen her skill. He had witnessed her integrity under unimaginable pressure. And now he understood the deep personal well of love and pain from which it all sprang. This was not a coincidence. It was an opportunity. Isabel, he said, his tone shifting, becoming the focused, decisive voice of the man who ran a global empire, though it was now infused with a profound respect. Henderson was not lying about my ownership of this restaurant. It's a small part of a much larger portfolio. I am the CEO of Blackwood Holdings. We operate hundreds of hotels, resorts, and luxury properties across the globe. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. For the past year, I have been personally spearheading a new corporate initiative, a project that means more to me than any merger or acquisition. We are launching the Blackwood Global Accessibility Initiative. The mission is simple but monumental to transform every single one of our properties into the most genuinely welcoming and accommodating destinations in the world for guests of all abilities. We've hired consultants, we've run studies, but we've been missing something vital. We've been missing a leader with a true lived understanding of the mission. He held her gaze, allowing the full weight of his words to land. We don't need another executive with an Ivy League MBA who can quote compliance law. We need someone who understands that true accessibility is not about ramps and automatic doors. It's about human dignity. It's about ensuring no guest ever feels like an inconvenience. We've been looking for someone with a heart for the work, someone who doesn't just see a problem to be solved, but a person to be seen. He took a steadying breath. Isabel Miller, I am not offering you a promotion. I am not asking you to be the head waitress. I am offering you a position as the new Associate Director of the Blackwood Global Accessibility Initiative. I want you to work directly with me and my executive team to build this entire program from the ground up. I want you to take the compassion and integrity you showed tonight and teach it to 10,000 employees worldwide. Isabel could only stare, her mind a complete blank. The words were English, but they didn't compute. Associate Director, Global Initiative. It was as if he was speaking a foreign language. Her world consisted of rent payments, bus schedules, and the crushing weight of old medical bills. His world consisted of this. It was an impossible leap across a chasm she didn't even know existed. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head. I'm a waitress. I don't have a degree. I don't know anything about running a global anything. You were a waitress, Damien corrected her gently but firmly. What you are is a person with more practical expertise in this field than any consultant I could hire. You have empathy. You have courage. You have a reason to care. I can teach you the business. You can teach my entire company how to be human. His expression was one of absolute certainty. The starting salary will eliminate any financial burdens you have. You'll be based at our corporate headquarters downtown. You'll have my full support and resources. You will report directly to me. He could see the storm of doubt, fear, and a fragile dawning hope in her eyes. Reaching into his jacket, he pulled out a simple, heavy stock business card and placed it on the table in front of her. You don't have to give me an answer right now, he said softly. Go home, get some rest. But the offer is real and it stands. When you're ready, call the number on that card. He stood up and Clara Ara followed her eyes, still holding Isabel's. As they turned to leave, Clara Ara paused and signed one last message across the empty room, a brilliant, encouraging smile on her face. I really hope we get to work together. Isabel was left alone in the vast, silent restaurant. The only sounds were the beating of her own heart and the quiet hum of possibility. On the table before her sat a small black business card. It felt as heavy as the weight of a whole new life. 3 months is not a long time. It is a single season, a handful of paychecks, a flicker in the grand scheme of a life. But for Isabel Miller, the past 3 months had contained a lifetime of transformation. The journey had begun with a single terrifying phone call, her voice trembling as she accepted Damien Blackwood's offer. The first day she walked through the gleaming, monolithic glass doors of Blackwood Holdings headquarters, she felt like an imposter, a ghost in a borrowed suit. The language of this world of leveraging assets, stakeholder synergy, and fiscal projections was as foreign to her as her own silent language was to most. The first few weeks were a crucible. She spent long nights in her new, impossibly spacious apartment, surrounded by stacks of business books and industry reports, her highlighter running dry. As she fought to catch up, she felt the condescending stares of some junior executives who knew only that she was a special project of the CEO and assumed she was profoundly unqualified. There were moments of crippling self-doubt, where the urge to retreat into the familiar shadows of her old life was almost overwhelming. Yet she was not alone. Damien had assigned his most trusted senior vice president to mentor her, and Clara Ara had become her constant confidant and ally. They would have lunch twice a week, strategizing and sharing ideas, their conversations a fluid mix of spoken words and silent signs. It was Clara Ara's unwavering belief in her, in Damien's quiet, steadfast support that acted as a scaffold around her burgeoning confidence, allowing it to build brick by brick until it could stand on its own. Today, that structure was being put to the ultimate test. The woman who walked into the 50th floor boardroom was not the timid waitress who once flinched at her own shadow. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, her hair styled professionally, she moved with a quiet but undeniable authority. She nodded to the dozen executives seated around the colossal mahogany table. Men and women who controlled billions of dollars and whose collective expressions ranged from neutral curiosity to outright skepticism. At the head of the table, Damien gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement before assuming a mask of professional impartiality. This was the formal presentation of her flagship proposal, Project Beacon. It was the culmination of 90 days of tireless research, planning, and passion. She began not with numbers, but with a story. Several years ago, she said, her voice calm and steady, echoing slightly in the vast silent room. I knew a young man who walked into a store to buy a birthday present for his sister. He was bright, creative, and knew exactly what he wanted. But the Clarks ignored him. When he tried to get their attention, they grew frustrated. They spoke to him loudly, then dismissively, and finally one of them shooed him away like a stray animal. Why? Because he was deaf. They saw a problem, not a customer. They saw an inconvenience, not a person. That store didn't just lose a $20 sale that today. It lost a lifetime of loyalty. It lost its humanity. She let the story hang in the air for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the faces at the table. She had their attention. That is the core of Project Beacon, she continued, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. We are in the business of hospitality, and true hospitality is not a transaction. It is an emotional connection. It is the art of making every single person who walks through our doors feel seen, heard, and valued. For the next 40 minutes, she laid out her vision with meticulous detail. She presented a multi-tiered plan for comprehensive staff training in disability awareness and basic sign language. She detailed a technology overhaul integrating accessibility features into the Blackwood booking app and in room services. She proposed strategic partnerships with disability advocacy groups in key markets to ensure their efforts were authentic and impactful. When she got to the budget, a notoriously frugal executive, Mr. Sterling, the chief financial officer, steepled his fingers. Ms. Miller, this is all very admirable, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. But the initial capital outlay you're proposing is substantial. I'm not seeing a clear, quantifiable return on investment here. We are a business, not a charity. This was the moment the old Isabel would have crumbled, but the woman standing before them now was forged in a different fire. Thank you for that question, Mr. Sterling, she replied, her tone even and respectful, betraying no intimidation. You're right. We are not a charity. We are a leader in the luxury hospitality market, a market that is projected to grow by capturing the loyalty of an increasingly diverse clientele. She clicked to a slide filled with data. The global market for accessible tourism is valued at over $150 billion annually. This isn't just about capturing a new market. It's about cementing the loyalty of our existing one. When a family with a disabled member finds a place that truly welcomes them, they don't just come back. They become your most vocal ambassadors. The ROI won't just be measured in dollars, but in brand reputation and free press, and in becoming the undisputed industry standard for inclusive luxury. This isn't an expense, Mr. Sterling. It's the single best investment in the future and soul of our brand that we could possibly make. A murmur of impressed assent went around the table. She had not only answered his challenge, but had turned it into one of her strongest points. When she finished her presentation, the silence was broken, not by polite applause, but by a genuine, sustained ovation. Damien Blackwood allowed himself a small, proud smile. The project was approved unanimously. Later that afternoon, Isabel stood in her office, the city sprawling out in a breathtaking panorama before her. On her desk next to her computer sat a small silver frame. It held a faded photograph of a smiling teenage girl and a younger boy with a mischievous grin, his hands frozen mid-sign. She picked it up, her thumb gently tracing her brother's face. All the late nights, all the anxiety, all the moments of feeling lost, it had all led to this. She was building a world where Leo would not have been shooed away, but welcomed with open arms. The door opened softly. It was Clara Ara, a wide grin on her face. Sterling looked like you stole his lunch money. She signed her movements sharp and joyful. He never backs down. You were incredible. Isabel laughed, a genuine, easy sound. I had a good reason to fight. She signed back, gesturing to the photo of Leo. Just then, Damien appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened. I trust you two are finished plotting your corporate takeover, he joked. He looked at Isabel, the professional mask gone, replaced by sincere admiration. What you did in there today, Isabel, it was more than I could have hoped for. You didn't just present a project. You presented a new philosophy. You gave this company a conscience. We all did, Isabel insisted, acknowledging the crucial role he and Clara had played. Perhaps, Damien conceded. But you were the voice, which is why we need to celebrate. I've made a reservation for us tonight, a small, out-of-the-way place. You may have heard of it. The Gilded Compass. Isabel looked at him, surprised. The restaurant was the site of her deepest humiliation and her greatest turning point. Returning there felt symbolic. It's under new management, Damien added with a wry smile. I'm told the new general manager is an absolute stickler for guest dignity, a direct recommendation from the associate director of accessibility. In fact, standing there flanked by the brother and sister who had so profoundly changed her life, Isabel felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of a gilded cage. She was the architect of a more compassionate world, building it from the inside out. Her journey had begun with a silent hello, a language of the heart that only a few could understand. But now she had found her voice, and it was about to be heard all across the globe. And so Isabel's silent hello became the start of a powerful new chapter, proving that the greatest strength can be found in the quietest acts of compassion. Her story reminds us that you never know who is watching, and that a single moment of empathy can have a ripple effect you can't even imagine. It shows that our deepest wounds can often become the source of our greatest purpose. If this story touched your heart, please let us know by hitting the like button and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. What did you think of Damien's decision? What would you have done in Isabel's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about the hidden heroes who change the world. One small kind act at a time. Thank you for listening.